So we know now that when we say to Firebase we want to use functions, when we initialize Firebase on the front end, it creates this functions folder. Now inside there we have a node modules folder for any kind of third-party libraries or other packages we need. Then inside this index file, this is where we create our Firebase functions. Okay, so first of all, up here, we need to require Firebase functions for this to work, because every time we create functions, we're using this thing right here. Now, Firebase has created this dummy function for you to have a look at, but I'm not going to pay attention to that. What I'd like to do is create a function that's relevant to our application, this GeoNinjas one. So what we're going to do is create a callable function, and that function is going to be responsible for checking our database to make sure that the alias a user has entered is unique. If you remember back to the last chapter where we created this GeoNinjas project, we did all of that checking from the front end to see if a user's alias is unique. And I said, I want to push this to a Firebase function instead. That's what we're going to do. So every time we make a new function, the first thing we want to do is say exports and then the name of the function. So I'll call this check alias. So then we're exporting this function to be used, so then we can call it from the front end when we need it. Okay? So we're going to set this equal to functions.https.onCall, which is a callable function. So this function takes a callback function, and this callback function has two parameters, a data parameter and a context parameter. I'll explain these in a second. Okay, so we're saying here we want to create a HTTPS onCall function, which means we can call it from the front end. Now, when we do call it from the front end, this function here is going to fire. And when it fires, we get a data property, and that includes any data that we've sent with this request to call this function, and also the context of the request, such as user authentication status. Okay? So what we want to do inside this function is interact with the database and see if a user's username or slug of the username is unique. Now, in order for us to interact with the database over here, we're going to have to import the Firebase admin library. It's a little bit different from the front end, how we'd initialize Firebase on that. Here, we just need to import the Firebase admin library and then initialize our app. So we can say const admin is equal to require, and it's going to be Firebase-admin. And then we just need to say admin.initialize app. So now we're free to access the Firestore on this admin object. So then, first of all, let's get a reference to our database. We'll say const ref is equal to admin.firestore to access the Firestore. Then we want to access a certain collection, and that collection will be the user's collection. This is what we're querying right here. Now, what we're going to do when we call this function from the front end is we're going to send the user's slug of the alias that they want to use to sign up along on this data object. So we're going to try and find a doc in this collection now which has a certain slug that we're going to send, right? So we can get it from the data object.slug. We'll set up all of this bit in the front end in the next video. But for now, imagine when we call this function right here, we're sending that slug property on the data object. All right. So now we have a reference to this document. The next thing we need to do is return a result to the user. Is it unique? Is it not? So we'll return first of all, and what we're going to return is ref.get to try and get that document. And then, because this is asynchronous, we can tack on a then method which fires a callback function and takes that document we're trying to retrieve. So in here, what we can do is then return again to the user an object. So this is the object that will ultimately be returned to the user. Now, what do we want to send to the user? Well, ultimately, we want to tell them if this username or if this alias is unique. Now, this object can contain as many different properties as you want. I just want to put on one property, and that is going to be called unique, to say whether this is going to be unique or not. And I'm going to set it equal to not doc.exists. So remember, we're getting the doc back here when we try to retrieve it. If the document exists, then this thing right here, doc.exists, will be true. Now, obviously, if it exists and this is true, then it's not unique, the username or the alias. So unique, we don't want to equal true, we want to equal false. So that's why we put not in front of it to negate that, okay? So if it already exists, we're going to send back false for unique. And we know that then on the front end. Okay, so we can also attach a catch method here to catch any kind of error. And inside here, what we'll do is throw a new function .https error. And this error will have a little message, failed to connect. Okay, just in case there's a connection problem with the database. All right, and that's functions, by the way, not function. All right, so that's pretty much our function created. So what we need to do now is deploy this to Firebase so that in the next video, we can go ahead and call this function. So the way we do that is by saying Firebase deploy. And if we run this, it's going to deploy our functions, but also the rest of the application as well. We just want to deploy the functions. So we can say -- only and then functions like so. And that will only deploy the functions and leave the rest of the app as it is because we've not changed that. Okay, cool. So that's now complete. So if we check over here, okay, we can see that function, but let's just refresh just to make sure that nothing else has happened since. Cool, so we still get that function right there. So that's being stored now by Firebase, and then from our application, from the front end, whenever we want to, we can call this function. So that's what we're going to look at in the next video.